Well, good evening. This is a new experience for me to talk to people after dinner. Sometimes I talk to people after lunch, and that's when people fall asleep, I hope. This talk has a little bit different title in your program, but it's basically going to be the same kind of thing. I really am becoming more and more interested in the parallels that seem to occur between what we've been measuring in the Global Consciousness Project and what we know about human consciousness. Now, quite a number of you have heard me talk many times, but I need to give a very brief introduction to the Global Consciousness Project. Basically, it's a large-scale international collaboration. There are usually around 100 people working or participating in one way or another. Friends and colleagues around the world. Many people I haven't actually ever met, but I would love to. We use the same kind of random event generator technology that's used in laboratory experiments. True random number generators, that is, not pseudo, but physical random number generators. What we do is look at the data produced by a large number of these, around 70 at the present time, which are generating data every second and therefore creating parallel sequences of data in locations all around the world, very much like the kind of network that Roland just talked about. In fact, we have now 3, and we'll soon have a couple of more, GCP nodes exactly where the GCI is setting up nodes. The question that we're asking is, can we find any evidence of something that might be called global consciousness? And I know many of you would like me to define the term. Basically, what we wind up doing is what I think is properly called an operational definition. So I'll talk about that just a little bit. Basically, we look for events in the world which we think will bring large numbers of people together in a coherent or resonant manner, may drive many people to feel the same emotions at the same time. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that kind of thing. And we predict that there will be changes in the output of quantum level, quantum-based physical random number generators correlated with these special states that are shared by large numbers of people around the world, driven by what we call global events. So that's kind of an operational definition. The global consciousness is supposed to be driven by major events affecting large numbers of people, and that in turn we expect will in some way correlate with the data that we're acquiring in parallel streams from this network around the world. Long-winded. Basically, it's, I think I will wind up hoping to suggest that there is a kind of interconnection among us which creates something new, which might deserve the name of a global consciousness. Talk a little bit more about it later. This is a map, Google map, where you can, if you're online on the website, you can point at one of those identifier points and discover who's running it, what kind of REG is being used, and exactly where it is, and so forth. That map shows all the devices that ever have been contributing data, and there have been quite a number over 13 years that we've been doing this, which have contributed for a while, and then maybe a couple of years, and then something happened that made that one go out of service, another one comes in. What we are asking is whether during major events like natural disasters or terrible accidents that affect very large numbers of people and, take over the news headlines, that sort of thing. If a war starts, if we have a great celebration like New Year's, maybe we will find some kind of deviation from what random number generators should do during the period of time of, the celebrations at New Year's, or political events, and a variety of other kinds of things. Here's a particularly strong example. This is unusually strong. The period of time is a week, no, 9 days, with 9/11, September 11th, 2001, right in the center of it. And what we see on the left is the data presented the way we usually do, a random walk. It doesn't have any trend. It's just taking a step upward or downward depending on the aggregated data from all these random number generators during each second and then plotted as a function of time. So the first few days you see nothing much is happening that looks unusual, but I think it's just terribly obvious that something unusual begins around the time of the terrorist attacks on 9/11. It continues for more than 2 days, and this is extraordinary. In our database at the time that we examined this, there was no other day in the database that even began to look like this. We have many other kinds of measures that we can look at, now a second example is a different kind of measure. In this case, we're looking at the variance among those devices which are operating at a given time. And usually we look at the frequency, at the data second by second. So we look at the variance among the devices during 1 second and the next second and accumulate that data over a longer period of time. This is looking at New Year's, and that picture just shows you how we put the data together so we can combine all the time zones and all the years and so forth. And here is 1 year, which I selected this data selection for its very sharp and clear pattern. It's not quite as strong as that every year, but what you see is a 30-minute period beginning 15 minutes before, and this variance measure should be around 0. It begins to drop a few minutes before. It bottoms out exactly at midnight and then comes back up and becomes normal again. Here is the combination over the past 13 New Years. The pattern is a little less clear, but I think it's still obvious that the variance drops down to a lower level. It's almost as if the system becomes a little more calm as people come together, join together, prepare themselves to lift a glass or hug somebody right at midnight. A lot of the examples that a lot of the events we look at point to certain kinds of emotions as being maybe more important than others, and one of the most important of those seems to be compassion. I'll show you a little bit more precise version of that statement shortly, but I also think that that we're beginning to get to the point where we can talk about what it's made of. Why are these random number generators changing? The answer is by no means complete yet, but the best models that we have found so far to fit the data across several different parameters that can be measured are something like fields, not electromagnetic fields. There are good reasons to assert, and there's evidence that it can't be electromagnetic fields, but maybe we can be talking about information fields. I actually like the idea of consciousness field, but even information fields are not well defined so far. I hope they will be soon. This is a picture of all the events up to a few days ago in May. There are 365 or 6, something like that. And what you see here is just a scatter plot of the terminal value for each of those, that is the composite for the event, a single number. Each of those dots represents one event, and you can see the range is pretty big. The expectation is the black dotted line. The grand mean isn't very far separated from that, so it doesn't look terribly impressive, perhaps. But those of you who do statistics are aware of the power of n, and what we actually have here is a z-score of more than 6. It's a 6 sigma result, the sort of thing that people in physics believe is a good starting point for believing there's something real in their experiments. Here's a different way of looking at it. This is using a cumulative deviation, a plot, a positive deviation if the score for one event is positive and a negative deviation following that. So you get a progressive sum of the deviations, and that, I think, probably looks a good deal more impressive. Okay. A lot of people want to know about control data. There are a number of ways we can do that, but I'll show you a picture of the kind of control data I think is best. You can do resampling of the data that don't have events in it. About 98% of the data aren't used in our formal tests. So resample that many times with events, an event sequence just like the real sequence, but displaced randomly in time. Or you can use random simulations. And you can see this cloud of gray lines represents what random data of this sort should look like. And the red line is clearly different from that. So we have a solid basic result. The main measure is a kind of pairwise correlation. There are lots and lots of pairs when you have 60 different devices. We have a second correlation which is somewhat like a correlation of variances compared with a correlation of means. We have spatial structure and temporal structure, and I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes talking about the justification for the title of my talk, psychological and social categories for these events and how they look. This is just a kind of a sorting of all the events we have into categories of war on the very far left. It's got a pretty big error bar, but it's significant. The next one is politics. I was very surprised. I am personally surprised about that, but I guess it's important. Who does what in the political realm? Major accidents. Here's one that's very interesting. Grand meditation events, organized meditation events. We've got quite a few of them, and so the error bars are small enough so that that's about a 3 sigma difference. Okay. Then down at this other end, we have some things that this one disappoints a lot of people. Great sporting events don't quite do it. We don't have so many, but we've looked at World Cup events, World Cup soccer, several times. And even though some people say, well, there's millions and millions involved, maybe it's because there's competition and not coherence. We can't be very sure. Here's something that's I'm going to show you several graphs that have very relatively small differences that may not necessarily be significant, but I think they're probably important for us to continue to look at. How many people are engaged? We don't know exactly how many, but that's probably also not just how many people, but it's also probably reflecting the importance in some sense of the event. So that matters. The larger the event, the bigger the effect size that we have. The level or intensity, power of the emotions that seem to be involved in the event. Meditation wouldn't have a very big one. An act of war would have high levels of emotional intensity. The higher the level, the more potent the effect size. The valence of the event is positive, different from negative, and the answer to that one is somewhat surprising perhaps to many of us. No difference at all that we can see so far. Here's one that actually has a rather strong difference. Is the event that's driving people into a kind of coherent state something that's imposed from the outside, or is it something we generate from within? A celebration like New Year's would be more generated from within. A terrorist attack is definitely imposition from outside. So the effect size of the outer source is much greater than that of the inner source, but it turns out that second orthogonal measure shows just the opposite tendency. The inner measures are stronger than the outer measures. Is compassion embodied or invoked? I mentioned it before, and here, again, it's not highly significant, but the difference is fairly considerable between high levels of compassion versus low levels. And I want to compare that with fear. And I think this may surprise many people. Again, it's not significant, but the tendency is for the larger amounts of fear, the more fear is involved in a kind of definition of the event, the smaller the effect that we see. A bit of a surprise, but my wife explained to me it shouldn't be a surprise. Fear drives us apart. Compassion brings us together. So what might this all mean? We're far from being able really to interpret this in a fashion that's well supported in a way, but I think that it's worth considering a really far out speculation that we really are potentially operating as a little bit in the role of neurons in a brain. There are now beginning to be enough of us to approach the numbers in a human brain. We do have evidence of interconnection among us that we don't know about, and my question becomes, what if we became conscious? What if we came to understand that we are interconnected? What might that allow us to be and do? And I suspect that one of the more powerful ones is something very much like Roland just said. We're capable of changing the way the world is, the way we are, and to make the world more along the lines that we would like to see. We're capable of intentional, conscious evolution, probably. Thank you.
Thank you. If we have a few minutes for probably about 3 questions.
It's interesting. I don't see that you're considering the directional change possibly consistent with, whether it's a good event or a bad event, like a war versus a love-in. You just treat deviation. Do you consider the directional change, and is there consistency with the directional change with the nature of the event?
It's a good question. We defined our prediction in the beginning as a directional prediction. We predicted that whatever the kind of event, positive or negative, it would, so to speak, excite the network and we would have a positive deviation. It turns out that there's a fair amount of consistency in a couple of kinds of events where I wish I would have made the other prediction. Very great meditation events often produce, or very powerfully focused meditation events, the best example I know, they tend to produce an effect the opposite direction from our prediction. But it goes into the database and subtracts from our overall total. But we're learning, we have to ask the question. Thanks. Yes?
I saw on one of your slides
A little louder.
a little note about David Hawkins, the author of Power versus Force,
Yes.
where I found the map of consciousness.
Yes.
And I was wondering why you put his name there.
Well,
You didn't have time to tell us.
I didn't have time to explain everything, but it's because he, I think, expresses very nicely a very powerful difference among types of emotions. There are those which create balance, and there are those which create imbalance. And I think basically I was trying to show that those seem to have a little bit different effect in the data from this rather abstract network that's looking possibly at something like a mass consciousness.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering how you differentiate, because the individuals that are sort of in charge of each node are not blinded to the fact that a terrorist attack occurred or it's New Year's Eve. How do you differentiate between just that one person or just you? Just your awareness of these situations and their direction. And I'm just wondering why you're going, that it's everybody affecting it than just maybe the one person, or again, just you.
Right. Well, it's a very good question, and some of my best friends in the field have said, it's you. I don't think so, and there's a couple of reasons for that. I don't, first of all, have much of a signature in dealing with intention experiments, but the most important thing is that we now have 5 or so parameters in the data which can be put into mathematical models testing those models against the data. So there are some, for example, DAT would be something that's expressing your idea, or an experiment or effect model is expressing your question. Neither of those can accommodate more than the first primary measure. You put in a second orthogonal measure and all of a sudden DAT doesn't do anymore. You put in distance effects and DAT can't deal with that either. a field-like model can. We don't know how to formally state a field-like model yet, but just the general field style of approach to how things might be affected around the world does work. And so I think I'm innocent, more or less. I think we all contribute, really.
That's a fine note to end on. All right, let's give our speaker a good hand of applause.